Rural Heritage on RFD TV is brought to you by Rural Heritage Magazine, a bi-monthly magazine featuring articles about farming and logging with draft animal power, small-scale diversified family farming and homesteading, and other aspects of our rich rural heritage. Rural Heritage Magazine, borrowing from yesterday to do the work of today. For subscription information, please call 319-362-3027 or order online at www.ruralheritage.com.
Hi, I'm Joe Mishka, welcoming you to another episode of Rural Heritage TV. This week we're in Yankton, South Dakota, where Tom Askjem and his crew are digging for buried treasures, so to speak. Tom researches old maps and municipal records to learn where boarding houses, taverns, hotels, and restaurants were located in the 19th century. He then works out the most likely location where people may have discarded items from their day-to-day lives. Bottles are a particularly common find as they don't rust, rot, or otherwise break down over time. And unlike china, crockery, ceramics, or other glass items like pitchers, glasses, and lanterns, bottles were often discarded when they were still intact. Not many people threw away a perfectly good glass pitcher or china teacup.
My name's Tom Asham. I was born in Grand Forks, North Dakota. I grew up there until the 1997 flood. My house was flooded up to the attic. I lived at my grandparents' place for a year, and then my parents bought a farm outside of Buxton, North Dakota. We moved out there when I was 6 years old. Actually, I think right around the time of my 6th birthday. Anyway, as a kid I would explore the woods, just kind of out of boredom, adventure. And I came across the old garbage dump and started digging through there, finding old glass figurines, bottles, all kinds of just junk discarded from the previous owners. I'd bring the stuff into the house and wash it up. And I brought in a 7-Up and Coca-Cola bottle one day, and I remember my parents thought that was really cool because they drank out of those types of bottles when they were kids. And one thing led to another, and I was digging in the dump almost nonstop, and as time passed by, my dad bought a tractor with a bucket on it. He was, using that to plow the field. They have a little vegetable garden, and clear the woods a bit, so I had him take some scoops out of the dump. There were some rocks and dirt dumped over it in some spots, so he cleaned that out, and then I dug the rest by hand. And it must have been about year 2000, we finally got internet out on the farm, and I started researching some of these finds, some of these bottles, and learned that the outhouse pits on these old properties were also a treasure trove for stuff like that. And the dump was just about drying up. I had spent so much time digging out there, so I asked my folks about where the outhouse was when they moved in. They told me the general area, and I couldn't locate it. But it wasn't until my dad was clearing some of the woods with a tractor I saw some ashes, stove ashes and glass come out of the ground. I'd read that ashes were thrown over the pits to neutralize the smell way back when. So I started digging, and sure enough, found the old outhouse pit. And a lot of folks think, oh, gross, you're digging in an old outhouse pit, which, if you don't think about it, it's not that bad. Everything's more or less turned to, dirt over the years, compost, whatever else. And very rarely there's ever a smell. Every once in a while I'll dump a bottle out, and it won't smell great, but, more times than not, it's just, just digging a hole in the ground. So I spent all summer digging the outhouse pit on my parents' farm there, and found stuff dating back to when the house was built in 1898. Even to this day, I'd say that pit had an above average amount of things thrown in it. So after that, I went around to the abandoned farms in the area, spoke with some of the farmers, or had my dad call, and ask if I could dig around, and most of the time they said, go ahead. So I went around digging those, and eventually ended up meeting a guy. He had moved back to Grand Forks. Grand Forks is near where I live, and he had dug bottles there for about 20 years. So he kind of showed me some techniques to digging in towns, and watch out for utility lines, all that kind of thing. As you can see, we found one here undamaged. I've never destroyed one before, so he must have taught me well.
If you enjoy seeing how our ancestors lived during America's rural yesterday, you're going to love looking at these books. Volume 1 is fieldwork showing horses and vintage tractors preparing seedbeds, planting, cultivating, and harvesting the crop. Volume 2 shows the work being done in the barn and farmyard, feeding and watering the livestock, getting the crop into the barn, milking the cows, shearing the sheep, and collecting the eggs. In Volume 3, we go inside the home to see the family in the kitchen canning vegetables, in the parlor listening to the radio, and in the dining room for family supper. We also head into town to shop at the general store or visit on the town square on Saturday night. Each book has over 140 large format pages. They sell for $24.95 each, or you can buy 2 for $44.95, or all 3 for $54.95 plus shipping. Call 1-877-647-2452 to order. That's 1-877-647-2452.
And I think to this day, I've dug a little over 1,300 pits. And that's coast to coast. I've dug, most of my digging takes place in the Dakotas. I'm in South Dakota right now. But I've dug in Maine, California, Minnesota, South Dakota, Kansas, Nebraska, Texas, probably a couple other states. But anyway, I've done a lot of digging. Part adventure. I'm also, into the history. I'm somewhat of a historian. I like researching the properties and, finding out about the people who lived there and, just kind of piecing the puzzle together. These pits help a lot with that. And one of my favorite parts about digging these is you get the real story. When you read a history book or whatever else, a lot of that can be watered down, and when you dig these outhouse pits, you get the full life of the people living there. Some of them, some could have been drunks, some could have, had a drug addiction, and sometimes I'll find pits full of liquor bottles or, drugstore bottles, and, one could gather a conclusion that there was something going on, with that. And, who knows, they could have had, a alcoholic house guest stay with them for a while, or, maybe the drunk neighbor was throwing his bottles down the pit, but it definitely gives an idea of what was happening in the area, to say the least. Bottles were made to be discarded. Unlike, I'll find dinnerware pieces and lamps, lanterns, and those wouldn't have been thrown out until they were broken, unless they were accidentally dropped down the pit. But the bottles, once they, the contents ran out, they were just discarded. And, I try not to focus so much on bottles specifically, but they are a major part of these sites, being they're usually the most intact pieces found, and they're more easily researched, instead of, some pottery fragments or whatever else. It can be hard to track down where they were made, when they were made, where they were from. You can get a general idea, but some of these bottles you get that, specific detail out of. The soda bottles, the pop bottles, especially, because what's special about those is that, well, one, they were made to be returned, so they had to have a designation of where they should be returned to, whether it be the local bottling works, in town, or, a few towns away. You'll get the bottler's name or the bottling works name in the town, which is special. It's unusual. A lot of the other bottles made were somewhat generic, and, you won't get the labels on them. They didn't survive in the ground after 100 years, so, you can only guess where it came from. But, these pop bottles, you can, get that definite indication, from seeing the stamp in the glass. So a lot of folks who do what I do, dig out these old outhouse pits, they're looking for something along those lines, something local to them, or local history piece, historic pieces. And I've been, writing books and documenting a lot of these pop bottles I've been finding. And I wrote one book on North Dakota bottling operations, which documents every soda bottle made from the start in about 1879 up to about 1930. And I also wrote one on Nebraska soda bottles, which documents everything from the start in 1865 up to about 1930. I'm also working on a few other books, one on North Dakota drugstore bottles. There was a site I dug, Fort Pembina, on the North Dakota-Canadian border a few years back, and every last piece was documented, put in separate totes for each site. I've been collaborating with a lot of historians across the U.S. on a lot of the pieces I found, and just compiling all this information. And I'm actually writing a coffee table style history book on the site, which is really going to be something. I was getting high quality pictures of everything, and it's going to be, full color, high quality, just no corners cut, basically. And it's going to be a really special history book, and it gives the full story, the true story. what was happening on that fort. And speaking of which, I think you had asked about really unusual finds over the years, and well, one of them was, well, I was digging in Crookston, Minnesota, in a circa 1890 yard, in a circa 1890 outhouse pit, and I came up with a pair of brass knuckles. And whenever I find a weapon down one of these pits, it piques my interest. There's that chance, was it thrown down here as a way to, get rid of the evidence? Could it have been innocently dropped when someone was using the outhouse? Pulled their pants down, the weapon fell out. Who knows? I mean, sometimes there's, a lot of the times there's no way of knowing. But yeah, that pair of brass knuckles in Crookston makes me wonder, could have been used in a bar fight or something along those lines. Or could have been something as simple as maybe, a kid got a pair of brass knuckles and their parents didn't like him having a weapon, so they threw it down the outhouse pit. But, it makes you wonder when you find something like that, and that's what's fun about it. Sometimes you never know and you can gather conclusions. But another interesting find I had was, well, that Pembina site I mentioned. There was a pit I was digging. What was special about the Pembina site was the depth of the pits and how well preserved everything was. The site was next to the river, so the water table was high. And when you get a combination of depth, water table, and clay, so basically the right ground conditions, everything stays perfectly preserved, most of it, including the sewage on that site, but that's another story. You'll have to read the book. Anyway, the cloth and wood objects, leather objects, all that organic material, it was all perfectly preserved. And I found, while digging a pit, it was an unfinished yoke for carrying water, is what I figure, where they would have had this stick over their shoulders and could have put buckets on each side, and hauled water up to the fort, which was common. I had read many accounts of water being hauled up from the river to the barracks, for drinking, cleaning purposes, whatever. And while finding this piece wasn't extremely unusual, I did notice that it hadn't been finished, which was something. It had been partially carved, and I found it discarded. It could mean anything, but I was researching for the book and found a newspaper article from 1876 that stated there was a murder on the fort, and it happened one night when a drunken soldier got in a fight with the storekeeper, and the soldier ended up murdering the storekeeper with a 2.5-inch wide piece of cordwood. Now, this stick I found fits the description identical. It's big enough. It could have definitely been used as a weapon, and it was found down the closest outhouse pit behind the barracks to the storehouse. And well, I'll have to do some more research on it. It's a definite possibility, that was the murder weapon. So, of the more colorful finds, I'd say those were, definitely it. There's a bird's eye drawing of Yankton, and I believe these houses that I'm digging behind were on it. The drawing was done in 1875, and these bird's eye maps were incredibly accurate. They would have hired a professional artist back in the day, and they would have likely taken measurements of each house, put all this information together, and then drew this map. And these maps are usually accurate down to the windows and doors on these houses and little buildings, all that kind of thing. So the map from Yankton that I got a copy of was found in a government building downtown. Well, there was a renovation or something going on, and it was found kind of crumpled up, and a guy saw it and kind of restored it a bit and framed it. And while I was digging here in Yankton, someone had mentioned the map, so I did some investigating and found out that it's hanging in an office downtown right now, actually, and I got access to it and got a picture of it. So what's significant about these maps and the lots, that shows buildings, is that even if a building is gone, say there's a modern, condo or something on the lot, or nothing on the lot, at some point there was an early house. So I'll go, talk to the property owner and, get permission to probe around, and I'll usually find the pit, dating back to that 1870s era or earlier. So it's kind of a cool situation, sort of like the past speaking to us in a sense.
And one of the ways that you pinpoint the location is using those probes?
Yeah, I find these pits with spring steel probe rods. I go around, I push them through the ground, and I first gauge the general compaction of the ground in the area, and then I feel for anomalies, whether it be a loss of compaction or just a difference in compaction. Sometimes we'll feel objects if there's no rocks or anything in the soil naturally. If I'm hitting something solid, I can usually conclude that the ground had been disturbed and trash or whatever else thrown down in the site. Yeah, I'm an amateur archaeologist. I'll get, a bit of grief once in a while from some folks saying, that should be professionally excavated and documented and this and that. Well, what I'm digging, is on a timeline, fairly modern for the area. I'm not digging anything prehistoric. I'm not, digging up burial grounds or graves. I'm not a grave robber or a looter by any means. And I agree that stuff should be dug with extreme precision, but with what I'm doing here, it's very innocent. A lot of the information we can learn from this is item placement to some degree, and even then, like I mentioned earlier, who's to say who threw the stuff in the pit? It wasn't necessarily who was living at the residence. It could have been the neighbor, or a house guest, but the items do tell a story. And other than items, I'll also brush on the layers that I go through. I am paying attention, to each piece of the excavation, where, usually the first foot or so is topsoil, maybe overburdened from the years, just dirt building up, this and that. And I'll get into a kind of mix of clay and dirt that would have been used to fill in the void. The pit, would have settled over the years, and they would have filled it in. Sometimes they filled it in with ash, this or that. But then I'll get to an actual ash layer, where it's just solid ash. It's usually coal ash. In earlier sites, it's wood ash before they had ready access to coal. But I'll find that ash layer, and I was told that somewhat neutralized the smell, and it was also a convenient place to dump ashes. Back in the day, all these places were heated with wood stoves, coal stoves, whatever. So they had all this ash to dispose of, and it was a convenient spot. So underneath that ash, I'll find a clay layer. A clay cap is what I call it, where they would have capped the pit off when they were done using it. And that clay likely came from the next site, the next outhouse site. When an outhouse filled up, they would have dug a hole and slid the outhouse over. So that clay, I figure, is from when they dug that next hole. They just capped the prior pit off, with clay. So you get this clay cap that's usually densely packed. Sometimes it's actually tighter packed than the natural ground. And underneath that, you'll get into the use layer of the pit, which is generally the layer they've went out and used, in the outhouse, the human waste layer. And in that, I'll find thousands of undigested seeds, raspberry seeds, tomato seeds, just berry seeds, all that kind of stuff. And mixed in, I'll find, the objects, the artifacts they threw down, whether it be broken plates, dishes, bottles, lanterns, broken lanterns, whatever else. And I'll also find thin layers of lime, which is bright white. And the lime was thrown down to neutralize the smell and keep the flies down, whatever else in the summer months. So, that's generally what an outhouse pit consists of. The use layer will consist of just many layers like that. And so, I do pay attention to, what I'm digging through. And, I truly believe I'm doing the right thing here. I'm documenting these. And, a lot of these newer sites in towns, even out in the country, they're not, the ground isn't a safe haven for this kind of thing. There's septic tanks being put in, urban renewal, construction, all that kind of stuff. And even this pit, you'll see there was a cable line put through it. I've seen sewer lines go through, and I've seen entire city blocks ripped up for apartment complexes to be put in. So I'm trying to do what I can to document these, and I've been publishing my research and sharing information. So it's fairly innocent, and like I said, I feel like I'm doing the right thing here. In a perfect world, there would be, thousands of archaeologists, professional archaeologists out there, lining up to dig these sites. But for one, there just aren't that many available. And two, there's so many of these prehistoric sites and these burial grounds, which, we can definitely learn more about. And that's what a lot of these archaeologists are focused on, which is the right move. I completely agree with that. But, it's just kind of the lack of interest and, lack of available folks to dig these is, why so many of them just get destroyed each year.
Why do you like Yankton?
Well, Yankton's mother city of the Dakotas, it's one of the first cities in the Dakotas. So it's some of the best history, and, I'm sure, archaeologists, professional and amateur, all like, finding the start, making a new discovery. And Yankton especially, can show what kind of products were moving through an area, in the early days of the Dakotas. And it's just kind of cool to see how pieces traveled way back when. And, a lot of the places I dig in the Dakotas, I'll find, objects from the East. So, there was that whole westward expansion in America at the time where, products were being shipped out west. And one of the more significant finds I had with, items being moved around was in a hotel site in Tower City, North Dakota. I was digging the outhouse pit and I found a drugstore bottle from Sandpoint, Idaho. Now, that's unusual because, like I said, there's that whole westward expansion. So finding a piece that came from the west, back east, makes you wonder, that drugstore bottle would have had to have been bought at that drugstore in Sandpoint, Idaho, and then made its travel back. So it was likely some guy out, maybe in a silver mine or something in Idaho, decided to come back out east for whatever reason and made a stop at that hotel in Tower City and, finished the bottle off, threw it down the pit. So, that's cool to see, how these bottles traveled back in the day.
This program is available for purchase. To order your copy, please call 319-362-3027 or visit www.ruralheritage.com. Rural Heritage is a bi-monthly magazine dedicated to draft animal farming and logging, as well as other aspects of our rich rural heritage. It is published by Mishka Press, which also offers a complete line of back-to-the-land books, DVDs, and calendars. Call or write for a catalog or subscription information, or visit our website at www.ruralheritage.com.